So welcome, everyone. And Scott, thank you so much for coming and being our guest speaker this evening. We are so delighted to have you and Red Sea. We love your products. I have a few announcements before I turn the meeting over to you, if that's okay.
Of course.
So, guys, the last time we got together was for the holiday potluck, and that was wonderful. I think people made new friends and renewed friendships with some others. Some pictures of that are up on the website forum as well as over on Facebook. If anyone has any additional pictures, we'd love to have those too and put those out there. The photo of the month is open, so you can vote for January pictures, and you can submit for February pictures, and the winner will get a $50 gift certificate to one of your choice of any of our sponsored local fish stores. So that's really fun too. And while we were here together, our bounce back promotion, and some of you may not even know what the bounce back promotion is, but we're coming up on a really horrible anniversary, right? And I want to celebrate everybody who's here. You guys have BBA. And you may go, what is BBA? It's bounce back ability. And isn't that so important for our tanks, this hobby life, bounce back ability? Well, this is probably going to be our bounce back year after that Arctic blast ice storm that was horrible. And I've heard some just awful stories, and I applaud each one of you because just by being here, I know that you've already bounced back. And what we're hoping to do is bounce everybody else in the club back. And so that's what the bounce back promotion is at the heart of it. It's a distraction, right? Let's have fun. And we crossed over the $2,500 mark in prizes. And Scott, thank you also for the Red Sea donations. They're a big part of that dollar amount. And all you have to do is be a premium member. So, and you may say, well, what's a premium member? If you're a free member, you can upgrade to a premium member. It's a $25 a year membership. Or if you're grandfathered in from long ago, you could be at a much lower amount, but whatever your amount is. So that's the bounce back promotion. And while we were sitting here, a whole bunch of things came in from Reef Nutrition. So after the meeting, I'll get the news out to everybody about that. Oh my gosh, let me not forget the Frag Swap on March 5th. So everybody I know is excited to get back together and trade and buy and shop and have fun. We are going to be looking for some additional volunteer helpers to set up and take down, as well as picture taking. There's so many prizes already, and with what I think is coming, I'd like to have pictures of every prize winner so that we can give that back to whoever gave us the prizes. So someone who is good with a camera, even if you use an iPhone, that's perfect, actually. But looking for just some additional helpers for the Frag Swap at the DFW Mass table, as well as helping others set up and take down, right, so we can do that more zippy. You've probably seen a few teasers on the website for different events that are coming, like the bus tour is in final planning stages, table at Reef Palooza all the way out to October, and all sorts of stuff. So this is truly our bounce back year. Let's put that terrible ice storm behind us and move forward. Your January newsletter is in your mailbox, so if you don't see it, look in your spam folder for it. And the par meter rental is open. Thank you, Drex, for that. I don't have any other announcements before we start. So I'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Scott. And at the end, I'm going to recap the announcements and anything else. Scott, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you for organizing this, given your busy schedule. You may not know it, but we're talking about the ice storm, and he's in Minnesota, where the ice is.
It is quite cold here. So thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm actually, as Lisa said, I'm up in just outside of Minneapolis, at a beautiful store called the Reef Collective. They have been kind enough to invite me and allow me to do the presentation here so that you didn't have to watch a boring water chemistry presentation from my hotel room. So again, thank you very much to Zach and the whole crew, and of course, all of your wonderful customers for showing up on this, what I consider to be a cold night, but I think this is a heat wave for you guys. So okay, basically what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to talk about water chemistry. Now, if there are any chemistry majors, understand I am going to try to do in 35, 45 minutes is just explain some of the basic interactions, you know, as far as how we test the water, why we test the water, what we're dosing, what happens when you put some of these things into the tank. This is certainly not going to be a college level, you know, training or anything else. So I am taking some liberties with the way that I explain some. So don't fact check me and give me 4 Pinocchios at the end of the presentation. Okay. Unfortunately, I cannot hear very well from my laptop. So if anybody has a question or anything else from Dallas, just wave your arms or whatever. Okay. And of course, for all of you folks here, you can just shout or throw something at me, and I'm happy to take all of your questions. Okay. A little about myself. I got a 10-gallon fish tank when I was 12 years old in 1977, just a freshwater tank. Really fell in love with the hobby, sort of like overnight. Pestered the poor pet shop owner to the point that he finally just put a broom into my hands and said, go sweep and I'll give you a black and white tropical fish hobbyist book at the end of your shift. And then I would end up getting cracked tanks in a tube of silicone and told good luck. By the time that I was about 15, I had 32 aquariums, which were everything from a 5-gallon to a 180-gallon in my parents' very cold upstate New York basement. And I had to sell enough fish that I was breeding. And bear in mind, this was in the 70s and I was 15 years old, to pay the $180 a month electric bill from all of those heaters that were flashing on and off. And my mother almost had a stroke when she got one of these first electric bills in the winter, because she had no idea why her electric bill had more than doubled. And the utility company sent the guy out. He went down to the basement, turned around, came back up and said, yeah, that's your problem, pointing at me. So anyway, I had gone into the oil industry for a while. That's not why I'm in Houston now. I actually stayed in the oil industry when I was in New York and moved to Houston when I got into the aquatics. But about 22 or 23 years ago, I just decided that I loved the hobby so much and I should just send out a bunch of resumes. And I got a job with Ocean Nutrition, like I said, probably about 22 or 23 years ago. I've been with a couple of companies since, and now with Red Sea for 13 years as the Vice President of Sales, basically the sales director for North America. We've got 4 sales guys that fly all over the country and visit great stores such as this one, to kind of help explain our products, make sure that people understand them and are using them the way that they're supposed to be. We've got some inside sales support people as well, and that's what we do. So again, tonight is not a sales pitch. This is not a Red Sea sell-a-thon or anything else. It's really just about water chemistry. And again, any questions that you have whatsoever, just feel free to shout out, or in the case of the Dallas-Fort Worth Club, just wave your arms and I'll come over and give you my ear, okay? So if I can start out, how many of you in here already have a Reef aquarium? Just show of hands. And how many of you have had that tank for at least 3 years? 1, okay. So moderate experience levels. And I'm sure the same thing with the aquarium club. We're going to see people that have started recently. We're going to see some people that have had their hobby for 20 or 30 years. So again, there's always all different levels of experience, which makes it sometimes a little bit challenging for me to talk about water chemistry without putting the experts to sleep out of boredom or giving newer people that, blaze, look, the deer in the headlights, okay? So one of the first things I want to do is explain that within our tanks, when we make any changes, whether we're adding calcium or magnesium or carbonates or anything else, it's not really as simple as it seems. It's not just that we're raising the calcium or raising our magnesium, or there's interactions. A lot of these elements do in fact interact with one another and influence each other. This is why it is so important to have the correct balance of elements as well as the actual numbers, but you want to keep them within certain levels. Okay, if you're looking to increase the growth rate of your corals, you can do so by adding a little bit more calcium and carbonates, and this makes it a little bit easier for the corals to build their skeletons because they don't have to reach out into the water and pull all these elements, across their tissues for the growth. They're sort of passively going into the corals because you have higher concentrations of water. If you're going for really intense coloration, what you're going to do is you're going to reduce some of the nutrients that are in your aquarium. The way that this actually enhances the overall coloration of the corals is that the zooxanthellae algae that lives inside most of our corals becomes a little bit more sparse. There's not quite so much. This algae that lives in the corals, it gives them this tremendous energy that can actually build up the great reefs that are visible from space. Okay, these little tiny animals can just do amazing things, and it's largely because of the energy produced by this symbiotic algae, zooxanthellae. When we thin those out of the corals, you can see the coral's natural coloration a little bit more easily. Additionally, without that algae basically intercepting or absorbing a lot of the light that we've got over our aquariums or the sunlight in nature, the corals need to protect themselves from the UV radiation. And just like most of us get tan if we go out in the sun, our corals, if they're hit with a little too much UV, they get purple or orange or green. Okay, so again, that's the relationship and the things that we control in our aquariums by understanding certain levels of nutrients and elements. To help to explain how some of these relationships work, I'm going to ask for a couple of volunteers. I need 2 men and 2 women. Any volunteers before I just pick somebody? Okay, anybody who volunteers gets a water bottle. Okay, nice Red Sea water bottle. So you can come on up here. Okay, you're in. Oh, you're both in. All right, that's a, and you're in. All right, so there we go. We've got our 4 people. I'll give you the water bottle at the end. I promise I'm good for it. So, all right, I have 2 guys. Anybody shy? You shy? You put your hand up right away. So we're going to turn you guys into elements. All right. So first of all, you are going to be calcium. And you guys are a couple. All right, I'm going to break this up. I'm sorry about that. Just for the night. Just for the. And let's see. You can be carbonate, and you can be magnesium, and you can be chloride. Okay. So if I can bring you guys here so that everybody can see you. Here, I'll step out of the way. You guys can jump in here. Okay. So these are just 4 of the 36 elements that we kind of worry about and we'll talk about. Our wonderful Dallas-Fort Worth Marine Aquarium Society. So these are the 4 elements that we're going to talk about as far as just explaining some of the interactions that go on. Okay. So most manufacturers will produce a bottle of calcium, which can either be calcium chloride, calcium gluconate, which is simply you're binding the calcium with another element, such as either gluconate being a sugar or chloride. The reason is, as you know, most elements like to be paired up with somebody else. Okay, they kind of have separation anxiety. They don't want to be alone. Some of them burst into spontaneous combustion, so we definitely don't want to do that. So what we do is we mix calcium with chloride. So we're going to bring calcium over here. Carbonate, you can just step away for a second. Okay, so we put them together in this bottle. Okay, so right now we have calcium chloride. The thing is, that even though I have stuck them in the same bottle, they're really not all that compatible. As a matter of fact, calcium really just not all that into chloride, if you will. Sorry. So basically, as soon as we start pouring this into our tank, calcium is going to give chloride the boot. And that's it, you're done. But hey, listen, this is probably going to be on YouTube and Netflix and everything else. So here's your parting gift, and you have to go now. Thank you. Okay. Don't worry, he's going to meet some very nice sodium, and he's going to live happily ever after. Okay. So now what we have is calcium is looking for somebody that she likes a little bit better, a more suitable mate. Okay. Which in this case happens to be carbonate. All right. Now, can anybody tell me what our corals skeletons are made of primarily? What are the major elements in our coral skeletons? What's that? Carbon? I'm sorry, I got old man ears. Yes, calcium carbonate is largely what our coral skeletons are made of. Of course, magnesium and strontium and a bunch of other stuff, but largely calcium carbonate. Okay, so in order for our corals to build their skeletons, we should provide them with calcium carbonate, right? Would everybody agree with that?
Yep.
Well, you're all wrong. The problem with calcium carbonate is it's sand. Well, you don't have any sand in your tanks, but calcium carbonate is sand. Okay, corals cannot use calcium carbonate. Here, I don't need to be blocking you. Magnesium, we have a very important role. Corals cannot use calcium carbonate to really effectively build their skeletons, because once calcium and carbonate bond together, this is a very, very strong marriage. Okay, just getting you guys prepared. And I'm somewhat of an expert on marriage because I've done it a few times already. So trust me when I tell you that this marriage basically will take that calcium carbonate and drag him down to the bottom, take him out of circulation, and he will be of very little use to anybody. Okay, that's what happened to me on 2 of my 3 so far. So sand in our aquariums is typically aragonite, which is calcium carbonate. Okay, in the oceans where you've got a lot of sunlight, speeds up chemical processes every minute of every day, calcium and carbonate bump into each other, form calcium carbonate. They attract another little molecule and another. They get little tiny oolites, and eventually they become larger and larger until they're heavy and they sink down to the bottom. This is what Carib Sea and most other sands simply are. This is very, very young, geologically young, new calcium carbonate. Okay. As you notice, when you put it into your aquarium, it does not dissolve and replenish the calcium and the carbonate in your water. Matter of fact, the only way you can really effectively break that bond, you can subject them to acid, which is what a calcium reactor does. Injecting CO2, you're creating an acidic environment, and then they will break up. Okay, but we don't do that. We're just going to use simple calcium chloride, and now calcium gives chloride the boot, but we do not want calcium to meet up with carbonate right away. Okay, because we want our corals, as they are ready to build their skeleton, we want those corals to be able to reach out and grab calcium and carbonate, put them together to build their skeleton. The same way that a mason is going to take concrete mix and water when he's ready, and he's going to put them together and then lay out and create his foundation. If you give a mason a bag of concrete that has been left out in the rain and it's already gone through that chemical reaction, not going to be able to build a foundation out of it. Okay, so how do we keep these 2 guys from falling in love and getting married too quickly? Well, that is the very important role of magnesium. Okay, see, magnesium also really likes carbonate, but not so much in a marital kind of way. Okay, just kind of wants to date carbonate for a while. Don't be getting all jealous and swinging or anything like that. Okay, so basically, magnesium is the girlfriend that helps to keep these 2 away from each other for a while. Okay, so if we have high levels of calcium and carbonate in our aquariums, and we don't have enough magnesium, what we're going to end up doing is creating very, very expensive sand, and you're going to have this white dusty residue all over your aquarium, and it's going to foul your impellers on your pumps and yada, yada, yada. okay? So magnesium will bond with carbonate, and they'll just date for a while, hopefully long enough for our corals to grab the carbonate and the calcium, put them together and build the foundation, okay? Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions at all on that? Okay, easy crowd, or else I'm just extremely boring. So I'm done with all of you guys.
Thank you.
I'll sign your elements later if you want. You know, I'm pretty famous.
Step back forward.
See me on Netflix, right? You're gonna put this on Netflix or something, you said, Lisa? Okay, so those are the major elements, okay? And before we start getting into, again, how we look for certain targets to increase coral growth or increase coral coloration, we're gonna get into a couple of other topics first, and then I'll hopefully bring it all together so that everything kind of makes sense. Does anybody at this point have any questions about the major elements? Nope. Okay. Well, thank you for that. So when we talk about major elements, again, that is largely the calcium, the carbonate or alkalinity, and the magnesium. There are then, of course, a whole host of other minor and trace elements, which are important to the corals, okay? A lot of people will say if you've got a new tank, you don't have to worry about the trace elements, just do a lot of water changes. Some people will even say that is true for major elements. As long as you do enough water changes, you don't have to worry about supplementation. If you are testing your water and you see that your calcium has not changed in the last 2 weeks and it's still up at 430 or 450 or whatever it is that your target is, absolutely, you do not have to dose. But we should not make an assumption that because we don't have a lot of corals, that these corals are not growing, very rapidly and requiring some calcium without doing a test. Okay, and a lot of people dislike testing their aquariums. It's not the highlight of most people's day. It's really not. You got to carry out all your little test kits and mix them together, and then the phone rings or the dog is barking and you forget how many drops you put in, and I think it's about 440, whatever. We're not always sure about the results that we come up with, but like anything else, if you do the test a couple of times, you become much more comfortable and familiar, and you'll start to trust your own results if you can do the test 2 or 3 times in a row and come up with very similar results, okay? Bear in mind, when we say that you should aim for 450 on your calcium, if you're at 440, you're good, okay? Some people really want to be precise, and kudos to them. But again, it's a hobby, and you've got to determine your own level of commitment and time and your goals. But if you're shooting for 450 and you're at 435 or 440, I can tell you you're good. You don't need to run and start figuring out how many mils you need to add to get yourself from that level to that level. But consistency is important, and again, that's where testing becomes so critical. As we start to have our aquariums go from that newer phase to the more mature, things will stabilize, okay? Once the coral's growth is slowing down a little bit, you're not adding a whole lot of new fish and corals, your calcium levels and your magnesium and your carbonates and everything else will begin to stabilize, and you'll know that you're gonna have to add 30 mils a week, ideally spread out at least over a couple of doses so you don't have these ups and downs, which again just causes the corals a little bit more stress, a little bit more energy in order to make up for those imbalances. But when we talk about minor and trace elements, while a lot of people will say it's only for the very advanced hobbyists, if you do a lot of water changes, one of our major revenue streams is salt. We love when people buy salt because they're giving us money, helping me pay for my mortgage. But the only thing that's maybe a little bit less fun than testing your aquarium is doing water changes. Okay, we were talking earlier, some people that have freshwater tanks. If you do a freshwater water change on a discus tank, your discus fins pop up. They're hungry. They're zipping all over the tank. They are happy when you do a water change. Corals, not so much. They tend to kind of slime up. They close up. You got water streaks, salt streaks going down the tank. You got your spouse yelling at you because you're spilling salt water all over the floors. Water changes are not very fun. They are important. However, your water changes should be to reduce things like nitrates, not to restore elements, okay? If you have an element that, let's say, is 10% deficient in your aquarium, and you do a 10% water change, you just look at the math, you still have a 45% deficiency, okay? The only way you're going to get rid of that deficiency is a 100% water change, which is obviously not advisable, certainly not fun. But even a 50% water change, you're going to go from a 10% deficiency to a 5% deficiency, and a whole lot of work. Or you can put in a couple of drops of some elements in order to restore those balances and give your corals what they need without them expending a lot of energy. You're going to hear me talk about energy a lot over the next 25 or 30 minutes, so I don't put too many of you to sleep. But energy is everything for corals, okay? In the ideal reef environment, there are very few nutrients available to corals. Bear in mind, where they pop up are, again, some of the most pristine areas. And the reason that they have formed this relationship, this symbiotic bond with this zooxanthellae algae, is because until the reefs actually start to build up and the fish move in and everything else, the zooxanthellae algae doesn't have much to cling to. There's not much nutrients or CO2. So the corals provide this spot for them to hang out. And the algae takes the sunshine and the CO2 from, that's in the water, and of course through the respiration of the corals themselves. And they provide up to 88% of the metabolic requirements for most of the corals that we're keeping in our aquariums. Okay, those that have the zooxanthellae algae. Okay, there are some corals that, of course, are not photosynthetic, but we're not going to get into that tonight because virtually everything we're keeping is going to be utilizing the lights and the nutrients. But the corals do everything that they possibly can to preserve energy, because where they come from, before they started building golf courses all over these areas, there was not a lot of energy for them available, okay? So corals do everything they can to conserve their energy, okay? So this is why, again, it's so important to have the correct lighting, have the correct flow that can move nutrients to the corals and move away waste products and everything else. But the main thing we want to do is make it easy for the corals to take the elements that they require out of the water. Now, understand, when a coral wants to build its skeleton, the more calcium that is in the water, that calcium is going to passively go through the tissues of the coral, and the coral can use those elements for, again, building its skeleton, other metabolic processes. And the corals will also actively transport these elements, okay, by, again, just taking some liberties here, reaching out into the water. Sometimes they will do this with other elements, and there's a tremendous amount of chemistry that's going on in these corals. I mean, they are honestly just amazing little factories that they can take all of these elements and do what they do. But again, it's all at the cost of energy. Now, if we don't have enough in the water, as a coral keeps trying to pull it in, the surrounding water keeps trying to take it back out, okay? Every element wants to find an equilibrium, right? If we take a 5-gallon bucket of fresh water and you fill up a latex balloon, which is porous, like a coral's tissues, you fill up that balloon with warm blue salt water and drop it into the cold bucket of fresh water. Within a matter of hours, you're going to have the water is going to be the same temperature. The blue dye or ink is going to go out and it's going to disperse. The salt is. You're going to end up having the same elemental pressures on both sides of that membrane, okay, which in this case is a porous latex balloon, but it's the same thing with the corals, okay? So anytime that we create imbalances, whether we don't have enough, it means that the corals are fighting against that natural tendency for elements to then want to go back out. or if we have too much of something, because somebody told us that, potassium is really important to get the colors in your corals. So you're doing all this spray and pray, because most of us are not testing potassium. You can, but trust me, you don't want to. But people will tell you, oh, you need more potassium, you need more iodine, you need more of this, you need more of that. And sometimes, again, we just start spraying because this guy doses a bunch of potassium and his corals look great, so I'm going to do it. But nothing could be further from the truth unless you explore everything that's going on in that person's amazing tank to figure out why he needs so much, more iodine or potassium or whatever. Okay. So one thing that Red Sea came up with, since we don't want to test and sometimes cannot test all of these elements, the trace elements and the minor elements, is we've come up with a very predictable rate at which the corals utilize these cofactors based upon their calcium uptake. Okay, so we know, for instance, that when a coral takes a gram of calcium out of the water to build its skeleton and use it for other metabolic processes, that he's also going to take out 0.00312 of rubidium and 0.000416 of strontium. And I'm making all these numbers up, of course, but you understand it's a very, very predictable ratio, much in the same way that we know that if you have a 2,000 calorie diet, according to Cheerios, that you need to have so much vitamin C, vitamin D, and that's what they put in, to make sure that you're getting all the nutrients that you require. And for the corals, we know that when you add these 4 bottles, okay, and the reason that there's 4 bottles is when you start to really concentrate elements, as we learned from our magnesium, stealing carbonate away from calcium, they react with one another. They'll oxidize, they'll bond together. Okay, so we need to have 4 different bottles for these minor and trace elements so that we can concentrate them and have them effective, and also not have you paying for a ton of water to be shipped across the ocean. And you simply add these, if you're using our calcium, at a rate of 1 mil to each 100 mils of the calcium that you're using, and you're restoring those minor and trace elements. Each one of these 4 bottles has a lead element that is testable if you do want to have that extra surety as far as what you're dosing. Okay, so for instance, the Reef Colors A, the lead element that you can test is iodine. Okay, this has different halogens and comparable elements, so you can in fact test the iodine that is in that bottle. This one, as I said, you can test the potassium if you are somewhat masochistic and want to do that 20-minute test and hope that it comes out right. This one, you can test your iron. Okay, so again, for those people that want to have a higher degree of accuracy, you can in fact test some of the elements, but if you simply add this, on that same ratio as what's in the instructions and all of our information, you are largely restoring the elements that we know the corals have taken out. Okay. Again, water changes are very important because they do help me to pay my mortgage. So don't stop doing them, but use those to control the nitrates, that are in your tank, especially the newer systems. You're going to have different toxins and things building up in your water that a water change, of course, cannot replace. Okay. So we talked about the major elements, minor and trace elements. Any comments, questions? And please, if you disagree with something, let me know. If I don't have the answer, I can try to find it out for you. But again, we're just as interested to hear your feedback. Yes. Yes, and that's a very good question. How did we come up with the ratios of the elements and what goes in? Okay, Red Sea did about 7 years of research. We did basically anytime that you're trying to do true scientific research, you've got to be able to duplicate your findings over and over again and go at them from different angles. So, one of the first things we did, which is very, very easy, is simply to take corals, including the tissues, and grind them up and look at the elemental composition. Again, that doesn't tell us necessarily what the corals require. It simply tells us what's in there. Okay, some of the elements that are in there may just have been kind of tucked away by the corals because they had to bring them in order to utilize other elements. But what the real research that we did was to house corals in many, many different aquariums. And as the corals would grow, and we would take the corals out and we would actually weigh them, down to the gram, and we would do ICP tests on the water and look at what elements were being actually removed. Okay. Now, again, if the corals are taking out, 0.0000412 of rubidium or whatever else, do we know exactly what the coral's doing with that? No, we do not. Okay. Do we know for sure that the corals need that? No, we do not. But bear in mind, we don't even know for certain the function of every single element that is in a human body or diet. Okay, so anytime that we cannot be sure of the impact of increasing, for instance, an element, like we know for certain that you can safely increase calcium and carbonates to increase the growth rates of corals. Okay, we know that works. We know that very, very solidly. The other elements, basically what we do is we just try to keep things at natural seawater levels, okay? So again, as the corals are taking calcium out in order to grow, and again, as long as they're balanced, because bear in mind, if you're using calcium as your lead indicator of the coral's growth, metabolic processes, you have to make sure that the calcium is actually being taken out by the corals and not precipitating because you've got too much alkalinity in your tank compared to your calcium or your magnesium. Okay, you have to have those three elements balanced, and then you know that the calcium that is being removed is in fact being taken selectively by the corals. Okay, so again, it was just looking at all of the different elements over many, many years and many, many different aquariums, softies, LPS, SPS, and again, even with softies, yes, it's not exactly the same ratios as what's going to be taken out with stonies, but they are still utilizing calcium. Okay, they're producing the calcium sclerites within their tissues to help to basically give them structure and form. But yes, a soft coral will use slightly different ratios, but again, they're negligible. And if you're able to supplement in this way, you're going to keep them very close. So basically, if you've got a tank that is just softies, then yes, the trace elements that they take out of the water may be slightly elevated in comparison to the calcium. But again, it's not enough that it's, and again, you can test your iodine, you can test certain elements that are in the water, which will give you, again, a good indication as to what the other family of elements, in that range, again, whether it's the halogens or the iodine. But to try to really come up with a specific recipe for xenia, for instance, it's really, it's so close again to what you're going to find with most of the stonies, that between the regular supplementation and your periodic water changes, it's better to be, in most instances, even if you're going to be slightly deficient, better than just haphazardly throwing stuff in and being too high. Yes, sir.
So if the dose of the color increase on calcium uptake, is there a way? So I dose supplements. Is there a measure, just in say just a pH per week?
Absolutely. Okay. And the one thing that Red Sea does is we don't want to tell you what you must do. Okay, we're going to tell you what we have researched, what works for us. But the wonderful thing about the hobby is that there are so many ways that people find success, and we don't want to dictate the terms of your success. Okay, so if you want to dose Calclosser, if you want to use a different brand of calcium. If you want to use a calcium reactor, what we will recommend is that you simply stop whatever way that you're dosing your calcium for 48 hours, okay? Test your water, you turn off your calcium reactor, you stop adding in your calc-washer, of course, keep an eye on your pH and your alkalinity, and see how much your calcium drops in 48 hours. You divide that by 2, that is your calcium uptake per day. And then there's a very easy way, I believe, look at the instructions, but I believe, again, for every 1 ppm of calcium that drops, or every 10 ppms of calcium that you would add 1 ppm of this. Again, I'm just, look at the instructions, or I'll tell you at the end. But yes, you can absolutely figure out your calcium uptake and then dose the minor and trace elements based upon that, so you're not stuck only using our product. Okay. Any other question? Minor and trace elements. How many people do in fact test for anything beyond calcium and alkalinity and pH? Okay, well, we got one good testing nerd. And what do you test for? You're the employee that tests everything. Oh, awesome. Yeah, potassium is not a fun test. So again, what we find is that a lot of people do not want to test their water very often. Again, it's not a lot of fun, but we would strongly recommend that you spend a little bit more time testing and a little bit less time doing water changes. Okay, which I promise you, from a company standpoint, that costs us money, because you can do a whole lot of tests with a $40 test kit compared to how many water changes you're going to do with a $70 bucket of salt. Okay, so it's not in our financial interest, but we want you to be successful. We want you to enjoy your hobby, stay in it, and bring everybody else that you know into the hobby. So again, that is our goal. So that's the reason why we really do suggest testing as much as we do and doing fewer water changes. Okay, how many of us here and within Dallas-Fort Worth, how many of us do regular weekly or bi-weekly water changes religiously? Okay, virtually everybody. Okay, and again, that is wonderful. There is nothing wrong with that. It's just it's a bit of work. Okay, especially if you don't have your own RO, you're going to the store, you're getting 5-gallon buckets, hopefully of RO or premixed salt water, and keeping your nitrates and your phosphates and everything else in check is very important. Okay, what else do we want to remove from our systems when we're doing a water change? Okay, again, we want to try to knock our nitrates and our phosphates down. What else? What else can build up in our tanks that we want to get rid of? Arsenic. Okay, well, you obviously know my second ex-wife. That's why I keep the windows open. But now, different toxins can accumulate in our aquariums. Bear in mind, corals themselves produce toxins. I mean, it's constant chemical warfare between algae and corals. Now, a lot of these can be removed with carbon use. That'll also help to clarify the water, get out some of the discoloration, which is super important because we want our light that we're spending so much money on, those units, we want that light to get down to our corals, and any turbidity that we have in our water, any discoloration, it gobbles up that light really, really quickly. Okay, so you can turn your lights up to 100%, and if your tank has discoloration, which you can usually tell just by looking down into a clear glass full of your aquarium water, or the tank itself, if you turn everything off, that discoloration really, really does impact how much light gets down to the corals. Not to mention, of course, we love our aquariums to look gin clear, which brings us to another thing, gin, vodka. When we talk about things like nitrates and phosphates, how many of us have heard of vodka dosing? Okay, how many of us do any kind of carbon dosing? Well, Lisa's got her hand up. Lisa, I'm talking about in the tank, not ourselves. See, she's got her water glass there. Basically, vodka dosing, I don't know what genius came up with it, but it was definitely a genius for thinking that We're thinking of, yeah, it was probably some drunk Russian hobbyist, you know. But basically, we've got a lot of beneficial bacteria in our aquariums. Okay, we've of course got our nitrifiers. We're going to take our ammonia and convert that very quickly to nitrite and then to nitrate. Nitrates don't leave our tanks very easily because the bacteria responsible for that are denitrifiers. They like low oxygen environments. And in our reef aquariums, where we've got massive skimmers, you know, pumping a bunch of air in, we've got a lot of circulation going on. There are not many regions within our aquariums that have low oxygen environments. Okay, so if you've got a chunk of live rock like this big, you may have a ping pong ball size or a lemon sized core where you've got some good denitrification going on. The problem is the amount of water that is passing through that live rock, can probably be measured in a day in ounces. So if you're trying to control your nitrates just based upon the live rock that you've got in your tank, even if you put another big chunk into your sump, there's great limitations as to the quantity of bacteria that you're going to get to be able to convert the nitrates. So what we do is we add in a carbon source, okay, which is what vodka is. It's a clean carbon source. And you can use sugar, you can use vinegar, you can use any good clean source of carbon. You add it into the aquarium, and all of the bacteria, since we are all carbon-based life forms, except for my first wife, they respond, okay? Now, the first bacteria that come in contact with the carbon source are going to be your nitrifying, oxygen-using aerobic bacteria. So we have to be very careful when we start to carbon dose, vodka dose, to start with a very small amount so that the nitrifying aerobic bacteria that are going to take the oxygen out of the water so that they start to reproduce very slowly, clean up the tank a bit, and then continue to add until we get to our target. What will happen is that carbon will eventually make its way into the low or zero oxygen environments in our tanks, okay, anoxic, anaerobic, and the bacteria that convert the nitrates will start to reproduce very, very quickly, okay? As they do, they're going to outgrow their little tiny apartment they've got in the middle of your rock, and they're going to be tossed out into the water column. And again, in a simplified explanation, their cellular structure, they've got a belly full of nitrate. Some of them will also be phosphate fixing bacteria, so they'll also be carrying phosphate. They get cast out into the tank, and our skimmer scoops them up, and it goes into our collection cup, again, with the nitrates and possibly the phosphates that they have utilized in their growth, okay? This is how we can control the nitrates in our aquarium, okay? On that topic, does everybody run a skimmer on their tanks? Okay, yes, okay, excellent. Some people will still use canister filters, cartridge filters. Bear in mind, if you do that, you'll sometimes hear people refer to them as nitrate factories. Whether you're talking about socks or a canister filter or a filter cartridge, the term filtration is actually a little bit misleading because they're really not removing anything from the tank. They're simply capturing it all in one spot. It's still breaking down and releasing, nitrogen in the form of nitrates and whatever other toxins are associated with it back into your water, okay? It's a nasty analogy, but it's like everybody using the toilet in your house, but you only flush it once a month, okay? Trust me, it's gonna stink. And the same thing happens when we have a dirty canister filter or dirty socks with a bunch of stuff that has collected inside of them, and we don't clean them out until they start to overflow. All of that stuff has been basically polluting our aquariums, since the last time that we changed them. The way that a skimmer works is most of the organic matter is, if you look at it down to the molecular level, one end of it is positively charged, one end is negatively charged. So one end is basically hydrophobic, the other side hydrophilic, which means that half of it wants to be in the air, half of it wants to be in the water, okay? So it collects right at that air-water interface, okay? This is why sometimes if you look at a, kind of nasty pond, we always call it pond scum. That's just all of the organic matter that is floating, because again, it wants to be right at that air-water interface. So what we do with a skimmer is we take a volume of air, we crush it up or smash it, with our impellers into millions and millions of perfectly sized bubbles, which gives us a tremendous amount of surface area for all of those organic molecules to stick to, okay? As the bubbles are rising up in our skimmer, they start bumping into one another. They get slightly larger, still carrying all of that organic waste. They become more buoyant until they finally rise up and spill over, and they are completely removed from the water. So long as you don't allow your collection cup to overflow and go back into the tank, they are completely removed from the water, as opposed to a mechanical filter, again, such as socks that you don't clean out regularly. So again, anything that mechanically captures stuff, whether it is the sponges or the foam in your tank that are there to catch bubbles so that they don't go back into your tank, keep these things clean, rinse them out periodically. Some people will tell you not to because there's so much good bacteria. Again, the amount of nitrifying bacteria that we typically have in our tanks, just in the live rock and the sand and everything else, is more than ample to go from ammonia to nitrate. Okay, controlling the nitrate is, again, much more of a concern for us than worrying about high levels of ammonia, so long as we haven't done anything in our aquarium to severely disrupt the supportive bacteria that are in there. Okay, any questions at all on filtration, how skimmers work, or how we control nitrates, phosphates? Okay, so since there are no questions on that, has anybody here had problems with nuisance algae?
Yes.
Now, if you don't all raise your hands, you're either all experts or you're shy. Okay, so everybody has problems with nuisance algae at some point. It's actually expected. It's a normal part of the tank's early maturation. You're going to have a lot of organic matter in there. You're going to have different types of algae that are going to come up, and diatoms. And you're again, when you've got organic matter available, nature is going to find somebody that wants to consume it. So most of our algae are able to be kept under control simply by keeping our nitrates and phosphates at relatively low levels, okay? Some people will say I have 0, and perhaps on their tests they are at 0 because they've got enough corals or algae or whatever in the tank that's removing it and it's not showing up on a test, but there's nitrates and phosphates in everybody's tanks. And truly, you don't want to aim for complete 0 anyway, okay? Because as I said, your corals, while they can get up to 88%, depending on the type of coral, of their metabolic needs, energetic needs from the light, they're still, again, a solid 12% or more that they're going to need to get from supplemental feeding and organics in the water. And most importantly is the zooxanthellae algae inside the tissues of the coral. That is what needs the nitrate and phosphate in order to produce the energy for the corals, okay? But we don't want these things to get out of control because then we end up having, again, a lot of algae in the aquarium. If they get super high, we will sometimes hear people that have nitrates of 40, 50, 60, and they'll tell you the corals look great, and perhaps they do. They should certainly be fat and happy at that point. But when you get high enough levels of organic matter in your aquarium, the zooxanthellae algae inside of the corals can actually go from being a symbiont to almost being somewhat parasitic because they become too plentiful. They will actually become so hungry for CO2, which again is not plentiful in our aquariums, that they can actually take the coral skeleton and crack those molecules and get their carbon dioxide through decalcification, okay? So again, this very rarely happens, but don't let your nitrates just become runaway because the corals look good. A lot of people will say that, well, everything's fine in my tank because my corals look good. And you can look outside and you can see a kid running up and down the street and hyper and happy and yelling and think, what a healthy kid. And you find out he's jacked up on Red Bull and Twinkies. Okay, so just looking at how something looks, yes, it's, you know, it's good, but testing your water, knowing what really is going on inside of your tank is what is going to help to prevent putting out fires before they ever start. Okay, so again, looking at the corals, if everybody looks happy, they've got great polyp extension, that is a wonderful indicator, and certainly what we want to enjoy as hobbyists. Okay, but don't let that be enough, because usually by the time that we find out that our corals are unhappy, we're most likely going to see some losses. Okay, because they've already started that decline by the time that we identify what the problem is, and usually we identify what the problem is based on the last thing that we did. Okay, I switched salt and Instant Ocean killed my whole tank. Nope, Instant Ocean did not kill your whole tank. Okay, it is probably somewhat of a coincidence. Again, maybe that change, you know, caused the last final straw that broke the camel's back as far as straining your corals, but it's very, very rare that changing a brand of salt, a brand of fish food, you know, will be enough to actually cause your tank to crash. Okay, so unless you've done something egregious, you know, greatly overfed, or, you know, put in the whole bottle of vodka when you were only supposed to put in a shot glass, you know, but again, most of the crashes happen because we sort of become complacent, the tank looks great, and by the time that we find out what the problem is, we've experienced a lot of losses, okay? Any questions so far on anything that we've discussed? Dallas? See, I wish you guys were Houston. I'd be like, Houston? Thank you, Drex. Okay, so when we start talking about food, there's of course a ton of different food, and depending on the type of corals that you've got, there's a ton of different ways that you can feed your coral. You can spot feed them, you can have a refugium, and hopefully, you know, create enough of your own little critters that they're going to feed your corals. There's all kinds of dried products, frozen products, liquid products. Overall, your corals do not have a very sophisticated digestive system, okay? They don't have teeth, they don't have guts, they don't have intestines. So mainly what they're relying upon anytime that they capture a particle of food, whether it's, you know, a few microns in size or a, you know, chunk of scallop that you're tossing onto your plate coral, they're relying on the naturally occurring bacteria in your tank to basically break down that piece of food. Very similar to what happens in our own guts. Okay, we utilize a bunch of different bacteria to help us to break down what we eat so that we can take it out and reassemble it into the specific proteins and nutrients that we require. The bigger that the particle is, the more time and energy the corals have to expend basically waiting for it to be, you know, broken down as they hold on to it. Ideally, if we can give the corals food that is basically as small as possible, meaning instead of giving them complex proteins, we give them amino acids. Okay, I'm sure everybody has heard of, you know, there's a ton of different types of amino acid complexes that are out there. A lot of them that are used in our hobby actually came from human consumption shrimp farming, okay, larval shrimp farming. The specific amino acids that shrimp utilize are different ratios than what corals utilize. Okay, we have a product that is called Reef Energy Plus, okay, AB, which you've probably heard of. What this is, it's simple sugars, okay? The specific amino acids that the corals utilize in the correct ratio for the corals themselves, okay? That just makes it a cleaner product. Now, if you dump in a product that has a slightly different array of you know, nutrients or amino acids, you're not doing them any harm. They're still going to be able to take what they require, but you're going to have some leftover aminos that perhaps the corals don't need, and they of course become organic leftovers. So this is very, very specific to corals, made by us based on our research, and it basically provides the corals with everything that they need in the smallest particle sizes, again, meaning the amino acids, so that they can simply assemble them into the various proteins that they require. When we utilize a big chunk of food, and again, by big chunks, I'm talking about even something that's quite small to us, the corals need to again disassemble that. It's the same thing as if I give you a bunch of Legos and tell you to build an airplane out of it. If I give you the individual pieces, you can get right to work assembling. If I give you a boat and tell you to disassemble it and turn it into an airplane, you need to waste time and energy disassembling it, breaking it down to then build what you require, being the airplane. And again, this is the same exact thing that we do. We try to conserve the corals' energy by giving them the smallest particles necessary. It's the same exact thing we do with baby formula. Okay, babies have very, very young, underdeveloped digestive systems, which is why we don't give them pork chops when they're only 2 months old. I learned that the hard way. We give them baby formula or breast milk, which is primarily the specific proteins and amino acids that they are going to require, along with the specific vitamins and minerals and everything else. Now, again, it is a hobby. We sometimes like to see our corals grab onto stuff, and there's no harm doing that, okay? So we're not saying that you shouldn't feed these things. You absolutely should. Do whatever you want that brings you happiness and interest in your tank. Just be aware of everything that you add has to come out, whether it's being utilized by the corals, the algae, or your skimmers grabbing it. So the more you feed, the more maintenance or better equipment you're going to need in order to keep up with that, okay? But by at least feeding this product or something comparable, you know that you're giving the corals everything that they need, and then you can give them a kind of a treat, which is again more of a treat for ourselves to watch our corals grab onto something. Okay? Any question about nutrition or how to feed the corals, spot feeding versus just dumping the product in? Nobody? You guys are very, very easy, or like I said, I'm just very boring. So, okay, again, sticking on nutrients, and we talked already about algae problems and how we can kind of control those by keeping our nitrates and phosphates relatively low. How about red slime algae? Anybody had red slime algae? It's all over your tank. Okay. How about you, Dallas? No red slime algae? Lisa, good for you. Okay, so red slime algae is actually not algae, it's cyanobacteria, okay? It has been on the earth probably longer than any, not probably, definitely longer than any other living organism. It's extremely durable. It's everywhere, okay? So cyanobacter has basically adapted so that it can live on just nitrate alone. It can actually even live on atmospheric nitrogen. It can live just on phosphates. Most higher life forms, even just our simple green algae, needs nitrate and phosphate, plus of course lighting and everything else. Cyanobacter can live on just about anything. So cyanobacter, being a bottom life form, really is just super opportunistic, and it fills in where nothing else can live. Okay, so for instance, let's say we have very high levels of nitrate and phosphate in our tanks, and we put a bunch of phosphate removing resin, and we strip all the phosphates out of our tank, and we still have a ton of nitrates left over. More than likely, we'll see our algae die off. Okay, it's going to start getting kind of brownish and then white and start breaking down, and we will probably see red slime, cyanobacter, take over. Okay, that is because not much else can utilize just the nitrates without the phosphates going along with it, okay? So usually the red slime is an opportunistic pest, if you will, that will sprout up when we have imbalances in our aquariums, okay? the first thing that a lot of people will do is they'll run and they'll get a red slime remover, which is typically a antibiotic such as erythromycin, which will kill it off. Okay, it's pretty easy to kill off cyanobacteria, but you're also killing off some of the other good supportive bacteria in your tank, and it's really kind of a band-aid. So you may kill off some of that red slime, but if the underlying condition is not corrected, it will most likely come back. So again, not saying that you shouldn't use that, but you definitely want to find out what the underlying reason is by testing, again, your nitrates and your phosphates together and being sure that they are in some relative balances to one another. Okay. Anybody, now you said you still have a lot of red slime in your tank? Okay. Mm-hmm. It could just be, yes, that you've got very high levels of organics, and especially if you are manually removing algae from your system so that nothing else is utilizing it, then yes, red slime algae can definitely join in the chorus of other nuisance algae or aptasia or anything else that, again, is opportunistic when we've got kind of high levels. And that is the perfect time to start doing some aggressive water changes. Okay, because trying to do something like vodka dosing, it's not an overnight process, and when you've got a lot of organics, you absolutely do not want to be putting in a lot of carbon source, because again, the first bacteria that will start to utilize that are the oxygen, the aerobic bacteria that utilize the oxygen. And when you see that big bacterial bloom, in the form of cloudy water, you can definitely make it dangerous for your corals and your fish. Okay. Another thing Drex just brought, I believe it was Drex brought up, flow is also very, very important within the aquarium. That helps to prevent the red slime algae, or any algae for that matter, from really taking root, and it keeps everything moving in the aquarium, which gives it a better chance of getting to your skimmer to be fully removed, as opposed to just settling in your substrate. Okay. So flow and water changes are probably your best initial thing, and you can cut back on your feeding. Again, it takes a while for the fish and corals in your tank to truly starve to death. So as far as, do you have fish in the tank? Yes. So we love to see our animals eat a lot, and yes, we enjoy it, but just at least get your nutrients under control. As far as the fish feeding, that is sometimes one of the worst, because there's a lot of algae-based foods, and what you see the fish consuming versus what's actually getting down between your live rock into your substrate, that's just sitting there. Again, as far as what you're feeding your corals, more liquid-based foods, which are likely to be removed from a skimmer, as opposed to heavy particulates that are going to go right down into your substrate. And once you get it cleaned up, you should see a return, to a cleaner looking tank. You can also, of course, siphon off the red slime if it builds up. And red slime can produce some toxins, again, that can become harmful to the corals. So it's also a good idea to sometimes just use some carbon periodically. On the topic of carbon, a lot of people have very, very mixed opinions about carbon. They'll tell you not to use it because it strips out some of your elements, or that it can harm fish and cause lateral line erosion. And it's somewhat anecdotal, but I think we've basically proven in the hobby that if you use an anthracite-based coal as your charcoal, not only is it not very effective unless it's been activated, but it can release fines. And again, this is still not, to the best of my knowledge, scientifically proven, but widely accepted, these very, very small particles, fines of the anthracite can get into the pores along the lateral line of fish and cause irritation and inflammation, which can lead to disease. Okay, so if you're using charcoal, it's good to use something like a coconut based charcoal, okay, which typically doesn't have those fines. Give it a thorough rinsing. You don't need to use much. Mainly what you want to remove is, again, the toxins and discoloration that will build up. The pore size of most of your carbons are simply not going to remove trace elements to any real appreciable degree. And again, there's no need to use a lot of carbon. Usually you can use like 50 grams, or a couple of ounces of carbon to a 50-gallon tank and let that stay in for about a month, okay, and then replace it, okay? Small amounts that are replaced more frequently will have far less negative impact, and it's the same thing if you're using a phosphate remover. You don't want to use a big chunk of it, wait till it's completely exhausted and then replace it, because that means your phosphates are constantly in flux, okay? So using smaller amounts with more frequent, changes of any kind of filtration or resins is always going to be beneficial. Okay? Any questions, concerns, input about carbon? Drex, I love Drex. Can send him a water bottle. Okay, so we covered nutrients, we covered feeding, we covered filtration, we covered major elements, minor elements, trace elements. The last thing that I'll talk about is salt, because of course this is a very, very sensitive topic. Okay, salt is of course one of the, if not the, most important decisions that we make in our tank. It's amazing how people will run out to the store and lug 89 cents a gallon RO water. Oh, thank you, Lisa. Lisa's holding up a bucket of Coral Pro salt, which I didn't even send her. I would have definitely done that as a prop. But they'll want to save 5 or 10 cents a gallon on the salt, which is, again, that's the heart of our water. So there's many different salt mixes out there, okay? And there are many good, solid, reputable, safe brands of salt. Pretty much anything I could name is a safe, proven salt, okay? Again, salt does not typically kill, does not typically, wipe out anybody's tank, as long as you're doing any changes to the major parameters in your tank relatively slow. I will just tell you the difference between Red Sea salts, because most people will ask us what we mean by a natural salt. Okay, our company is based in Israel, literally right on the Red Sea. We can throw a rock into the water. What we do is we harvest the sodium chloride from the Red Sea. The Red Sea is arguably one of the most pristine and cleanest reefs in the world. It is factually the most biodiverse reef system in the world. It's got a higher concentration and variety of animals. So that is basically our QC. When we're taking water in a very environmentally responsible way from this protected area, and we are allowing it to evaporate. Bear in mind, it's a desert. You've got 2 mountains coming down. The air moves down, dries out our salt very, very quickly. As long as that reef environment is thriving, we know that there's most likely not any kind of major contaminants or issues with that. When you dig salt out of the ground, that sodium chloride has also basically dried up as ancient oceans dried up, and depending on where it is in the world and at what depth it is, it could be hundreds of thousands of years old, it could be tens of millions of years old, which is all fine, but it has been buried, in the ground, and you've had water running down into it, possibly, some metals or other contaminants. Mastodons were urinating on it back in the day. So when you're looking at terrestrially mined salt, that's been there for a long, long time. Now, of course, before Morton sells us a pound of salt to put on our steak, they're testing it. But anytime that you test something dry, you take out a couple of grains, that's what you're testing. You're testing those grains. And yes, that is a safe representation. I'm not saying you should not put salt on your steak anymore, but you're testing that spot. When you test something that is in solution, in an aqueous solution, you're really getting a much better representation as to the overall quality, cleanliness, and elemental composition of that. Okay, so this is a reason why Morton and other companies will actually add binders to their salt, so that if there happens to be any little traces of metals or other things that shouldn't be there, that those polymer binders will basically scavenge some of those potentially existing impurities from the salt. You don't have this with sea salt. Okay, even when you're just cooking, when you go to the store and you buy some nice sea salt, which is again what a lot of chefs prefer to use, they don't have to put in a chemical binder because they can be certain that there are no heavy metals or arsenic or anything else, that is out of place in that salt, just simply by testing the water that they're evaporating. During the evaporative process, you're not actually taking sea salt and taking everything that comes out of it and throwing it back into your tank. As we saw, once calcium and carbonate bond together, they really become unavailable. They're not going to go back into solution. And the same thing happens with a lot of the elements, especially your major elements, will either bond to something else or become unavailable as you rehydrate it. So what we're looking for is primarily the sodium chloride crystal. So during the evaporative process, we will start to see first calcium carbonate crystals will begin to form, then some magnesium carbonate crystals will begin to form. We then take that water and we move it over into a different pond and allow that to evaporate further and further. We then move that very dense brine into yet another pond where we bring it down to the finished product, which is like 99.2% pure sodium chloride. The 0.8% is a lot of the exotic trace elements that you cannot add to a dry salt mix. Okay, you cannot add iridium or tritium or vanadium to your salt mix, because when, again, you're talking about a dry mix, if I take 1/1,000,000th of a gram of an element, how am I going to be sure that it's evenly dispersed between every bucket that that 3-ton batch rises? It's impossible. So even when you're taking stuff out of the ground, you're still hoping that the trace elements that are attached to that grain of sodium chloride are still somewhat representative of today's contemporary reefs. By taking it out of the reef, we have a higher degree of certainty that it is. Okay, but again, what we're mainly ending up with is a very, very, very pure sodium chloride that's got a whole host of trace elements still attached to it. We then add back in a lot of the minor and major elements, such as the calcium, the carbonates, the iron, and other things that we know have precipitated and left, and we can add those back into the salt. We have two different forms of the salt, one being our blue bucket, which has lower calcium and alkalinity, and the other being the Coral Pro, which has higher levels of calcium and alkalinity. Okay, and you've got both of the buckets, Lisa. She's got all the colors. Okay, so when we talk about high alkalinity, low alkalinity, and this will be the last thing that I'll talk about, because I know I've gone a little bit overtime, a lot overtime. Mainly what we have to decide is what we want to do in our aquariums. Okay, see, corals cannot grow super fast and be super colorful at the same time. Okay, because if they're growing super fast, it means that they have a lot of this Untitled algae inside of their tissues, which is going to basically obscure the natural coloration of the corals. And as I said, that algae is sort of a military olive, drab kind of a color. So you're not going to see the intense coloration that you would if there was less of that algae obscuring the coloration. Additionally, because that algae is capturing all of the light in the UV, the corals don't need to produce as many of the pigments to protect themselves from the UV. As we reduce the nutrients in our aquarium, the colors of the coral are going to become more evident. The corals are going to start to produce more of the pigments to protect themselves from the UV, and that's when the colors really begin to pop, okay? But the corals are not going to grow as fast because they don't have as much energy being produced. You can feed the heck out of your corals, but bear in mind, they're still not getting that energy as efficiently as they will from the zooxanthellae. So you're going to have one extreme or the other, or a myriad of spots in between. So you can have fast growing, beautiful, colorful corals, or you can go for the most intense coloration, which is what we would usually call an ultra low nutrient system, which means that you are keeping your nitrates and your phosphates at extremely low levels. This is where testing becomes critical because we're producing supermodels. They are literally a sandwich short of starvation, which means the slightest thing that goes wrong in your tank could potentially cause a crash because your corals don't have the energetic reserves to deal with things going wrong, okay? The good news is when we start our aquariums, we usually have an overabundance of nitrate and phosphate. So again, our corals have a lot of energetic reserves. They're actually much more durable than some of those brightly, amazing colors that we see in the more advanced hobbyist tanks. So they can deal with some more of the maladies as long as we don't let it get too carried away. And again, because most of the times when we start out our new tanks, we're buying, little thumb-sized frags or smaller nowadays, and we want them to grow quickly. And bear in mind, when you bring them home, if they start to brown up a little bit, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It doesn't mean you wasted your money on that, fashion name coral. It could just be simply that you built up more zooxanthellae algae inside the tissues of the coral. Don't go running to change the spectrums on your lights or buy new lights or anything else. Just give them time to adjust. And typically as your tank matures and you get a better handle on the nutrients, your corals will start to develop the nicer colors that you are hoping for, okay? But again, everything takes time, and don't just start changing everything in your tank because then you'll never know what is actually working and what is actually hurting your system, okay? Everything should be very slow, methodical, and give it time to basically stabilize to see the results, okay? So with all that being said, I am so sorry, Lisa. I know you said to try to keep this 45 minutes, but they don't let me out of the office so much, so I turned it into 90 minutes. So my apologies to everybody here as well. And are there any questions about anything that I've discussed? Yes, Lisa.
So we have some questions that I know people want to ask. In the chat was a question from Phil about how often you recommend ICP testing to get a handle on where things are. So do you have something that you'd say regarding ICP testing?
So the question is, how often do we recommend ICP testing? Okay, is everybody familiar with ICP testing? Okay, so we can test with our home-based reagent test kits quite easily, things like calcium carbonate, pH. A little bit more challenging if we want to test things such as iron and iodine and potassium, but there's countless other minor and trace elements that you just cannot test for at home. So ICP testing is when you send out a sample of your aquarium water. Usually stores will have a little box and you put the sample in there, you prepay and you send it out. They do an ICP analysis and they can give you typically very accurate readings of everything that's going on in your tank. We don't have a dog in the fight because we don't offer ICP testing. We certainly use ICP testing ourselves on every single batch of salt that we produce. But as far as how frequently you do that, I myself, and again, I'm just speaking as a hobbyist, I would probably tend to do it if I suspected something was awry in my tank, whether I thought that perhaps the live rock that I've got, if I got real live rock, or if I suspected that there was something in my source water, in my rock, in a piece of equipment, and I wanted to keep track of it because the last time I got a test, my tin or my vanadium was off of the charts, and I've done a couple of big water changes. I think one of the problems with doing frequent ICP tests just to do them is that it's very common to see something that will be higher than natural seawater or lower. And again, if you take corrective action on some of these minor and trace elements, you can sometimes do more harm than good. So again, for me, unless I suspected a problem, I probably would not myself do frequent ICPs. I'd probably do one just to basically solve my curiosity, see what's going on in my tank. And if nothing was totally out of whack, I would probably be satisfied with that. Because again, I've got enough confidence in virtually any brand of salt out there that they're not producing a product. Again, I can speak for Red Sea doing batches, but I think virtually all of our competitors also put out very, very safe, good products. And I don't think that that is usually a source of harmful levels of elements. So again, I know that I gave you a non-answer. Me personally, I would do, I'd do one or two unless I suspected something. Any other questions?
So Mark heard something on Facebook that perhaps Red Sea is not going to continue making salts.
Nope, we are definitely going to continue making salt.
Thank God.
Not only are we going
That
to
put us in a
making
panic
salt,
at the start.
we come out with some different sizes, and yes, as I said, that's an integral part of me paying my mortgage. So yes, unless they're going to replace it with something else amazing, we're definitely going to continue making salt.
Yeah, I saw that thread and I was like, what? Well, we're talking to Red Sea tonight. We'll find out from the source. Because I hate rumors, especially stuff like that where just some unfounded statement. And I wanted to know the facts. And I figured you'd say it. And actually, a Red Sea representative actually responded to the thread and said, we're absolutely making salt. And I saw that about 30 minutes ago. So 2 people have said you guys are making salt. I'm happy.
Well, thank you, Mark. That's Mark Levinson. For any of you hobbyists that check out forums and stuff, Mark's famous. Any other questions? Lisa, I think you said you had a couple.
So we have recommendations on nitrate and phosphate control in a reef tank that is heavy with fish.
Okay, so a reef tank that has a lot of fish, and obviously also corals, SPS, I'm assuming. Anytime that you've got a lot of fish in the tank, obviously it's a bit more challenging to keep your nutrients under control, but certainly not impossible. And again, depending on the types of fish that you have, you could have some tangs in there and some blennies and stuff that are going to help to actually consume the algae and turn over your substrate and help your tank to basically keep itself clean. As far as I'm trying to find our note box here. So basically, there's no way you're going to see these instructions. I'm not even sure that I can. But what we would recommend as far as a target nitrate and phosphate for what we would consider to be a mixed system, which would be a system that had fish, possibly softies, plus stony corals. I'm probably going to need somebody young to help me here. I cannot make out these levels. Who's got good eyes? You got good eyes? Look how small that is. And I even got LASIK surgery, just still can't read some of these little things. So,
that says number
oh, right here, I'm sorry.
0.04 is greater than
So 0.04 phosphate,
phosphate, and then 0.02.
and then 0.2 or 0.02?
0.02. 0.04 is greater than phosphate is greater than 0.02.
Okay. Okay, so basically less than 2 on the nitrate and 0.04 on the phosphate is a target that we would recommend for a mixed tank.
But how would you get to that target? I think is the question. Would you?
Again, the easiest way of really dialing in, and again, this is what controls not only the nuisance algae in your aquarium, but even the growth rates and the coloration. The easiest way to do it is truly with carbon dosing. The product that we use to do that is the Nopox, which just had somebody help me read the tiny little directions on the back. The Nopox again is it's a carbon source. It's a number of different products. It's a patented product made specifically for the control of nitrates and phosphates. And Lisa's got that as well. You are so awesome. You got all of our stuff. So what Nopox does is it is select nitrates and phosphates that will actually inhibit the formation of sulfur fixing bacteria in favor of phosphate utilizing bacteria. What that means is that it will control nitrates and also control phosphates. Okay, some of the bacteria, the denitrifiers will just remove nitrates and whether it be sulfur fixing or some other elements, but the Nopox is designed to get both nitrate and phosphate control. And this is truly so precise, as long as you're testing, that you can really dial in just by increasing 1 milliliter in a 50-gallon tank and see within 2 days a change to your nitrate levels. So the easiest way, aside from just doing very, very frequent water changes, is to do a carbon dosing. Just follow the instructions. Again, always start out with very, very small doses and slowly build those up so you don't create a low oxygen environment initially. Once you've got that dose up, basically your tank has been cleared of that sludge and you don't have to worry about it anymore. Start out very slow, build that up, and just continue testing until you find that sweet spot where you may only have to test your tank once every couple of weeks because you'll know exactly how much you have to add in. You're yawning. Sorry. I'll give you a water bottle too. Any other questions?
Yes. Lisa, I hope you're absorbing this on the nutrients.
What's that?
I'm hoping Lisa is absorbing this because she feeds tremendously a lot, and she needs a lot of Nopox.
Well, I'll send you a bottle of Nopox and a bottle of vodka so that there's no competition between the two. One for you, one for the tank.
So I get the vodka, and I just want to make sure because you could all. I could be drinking the Nopox there too.
No, you don't want to drink Nopox. Nopox has no. Don't want to drink Nopox.
I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
It's got some stuff in there that is not necessarily a good mixer, if you will. So with that, Lisa, I know that you wanted to make some announcements, and I've got a room full of very weary looking folks here. So I am going to see if there's any other questions they have, and then allow these 4 folks to head out into the heat wave, which is probably now down into the single digits. And I'll be right here, and you guys can go ahead and take care of your announcements, and I'll catch with you certainly before we close up.
Thanks,
Okay,
Scott.
thank you, Scott.
Appreciate it, man.
Absolutely. Thank you guys all so very much.
So for anyone who joined late, we have photos of the last meeting, which was the holiday potluck. If anyone has additional photos, please add them to either the Facebook or the website forum links, because we would love to see your pictures too. It was great. It was so nice for new friends to be made and reacquaint with others. The next announcement is Photo of the Month. It's a new contest. It was something that the club did years ago that's come back, and voting is now open for January. and you can submit your photos for next month, for the month of February. And if you're the winner, you get a $50 gift certificate and your choice of where the gift certificate comes from. So the club will get that for you, and you can pick from any of the club sponsors. So pretty much anybody near you, anyone you love, try out one of the new sponsors, whatever suits you, that's what we want to do. And speaking of you, I want to applaud everybody on this call because you have bounce back ability. Or you wouldn't be on here after that terrible, horrible ice storm and the Arctic blast that we had. But there is a bounce back promotion going on. To be part of it, you just have to be a member, and you probably already are. So that was simple, right? And while we were on at the start of this meeting, we heard from Reef Nutrition, so I'll be getting more of the details out to everybody. But we just crossed another threshold, and I still know that there's even more coming. What Reef Nutrition is going to provide is gift certificates, so that's not a tangible thing, but I'm only counting things that are in hand, and I know that there's more stuff shipping to us this week, next week, and so on. The drawing won't be until the end of February, but we crossed the $2,500 in prizes, so yay, very exciting. Yeah. The Frag Swap is another bounce back type of thing, right? Because we're all excited about that. So mark your calendars for March 5th at Bob Duncan Center in Arlington. We are looking for volunteers, helpers with setup and takedown, so we can make that zippy and quick, both for the setup and getting things stable for sales, as well as zippy and quick for takedown at the end. And then help at the DFW mass table with picture taking, the raffles, those types of things. And picture taking is really not of the Frag Swap, but there's so many prizes coming in for the bounce back promotion that we'll have to work out how we're going to get those out to people and get pictures. So that's where that's coming from. Which super, super exciting turnout there is happening for us. And keep watching the Facebook and the website forum. You'll see things go on the forum first. So if you like to be cutting edge, that's where we go first. But we've got events in planning stages all the way out to October already. So super excited there. So keep an eye out for things like you saw the sneak peek on the bus tour and other things. So that's coming, a spring bus tour. Your January newsletter is in your mailbox today. Please check your spam folder if you can't find it. And par meter rental resumed back around, I guess, since the potluck or thereabouts. So that's a new announcement. But if you've been watching the forum, you've seen that that's been super active. And applause to Drex for all of your coordination efforts there. I know that's a lot. Does anyone have anything else?
Yes, Lisa. I want to everybody give Lisa a big round of applause for all of work she has done within the past month. Without her, this would not be possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a labor of love. Everybody loves their aquariums. We just want to bring the passion back.
I wanted to thank you for handling this meeting today. That was very nice of you to spearhead this and handle it. So thank you for that.
Well, sure. Well, and you've done such a great job with everything. But I know that you're so busy. So whatever we can do. And if there's other people who are interested in helping out with the club and behind the scenes club management, sort of like I do too, I just think of myself as a helper. Reach out to me because there's definitely spots for you too. We'd love to have you and work more closely with you with the club. Does anyone have anything else that we want to cover? Were there any extra questions for Scott? I know he's working with his local people. But before we close, is there anything else anyone may have?
Yeah, I'd like to see if we can't find that other par meter the club has.
Okay.
Because I know we
will
had
hunt
two.
that down.
And
Okay.
I know I had it. I had one, and Michael, the old treasurer, had one. And
Okay.
he basically told me he turned everything over to Drew. And Drew said
Okay.
he would look, but I haven't got word back from it, which would make it a lot easier, especially for people that's over on the east side of the Metroplex. Maybe we can get somebody to grab a hold of that and sort of delegate it to that side of the Metroplex, which would be a big help to our members.
Awesome. Yeah. Oh, especially if we've got two going, we work through the backlog from COVID so much faster.
Yeah,
That's
because
awesome.
I know no one wants to drive from Garland all the way to my house in Keller. So, but that's all I have to say. I'm good.
Awesome. Thanks. Does anyone have anything else? I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording then. You will find the recording up on our YouTube channel. So let me do a plug for our YouTube channel. We are trying to build to 75 members. Woohoo! So if you're not yet, just go out there and look on YouTube for DFW Mass and become a subscriber. We would love to have you. The more subscribers we get, the more perks and bells and whistles YouTube lets us do. With more features. Mark said something about shorts. I'm learning about videos, and so, yay! So let your friends know too. So let me stop this. But you'll find this video out on our YouTube channel.